number of areas. I'm going to do a very brief introduction to what is an impact assessment. Willy, after this, will be picking up a little bit on that and providing a bit more information about the process. So I'm only going to cover the process lightly. And then I'm going to move on, talk a little bit about standards that are expected, in particular international standards. Again, Willy will be talking about national standards. And then I'm going to dig in a little bit to the role of stakeholder engagement as part of this process, and talk through some potential impacts linked to general projects, and highlight a few that seem to be linked to or may come out with field trials around genetically modified organisms. As you will have heard, my background is more sort of socio-economic and human rights. And so I will be taking that sort of perspective and leave the expertise around environment and biodiversity to my colleague after this. The other thing to note is I'm currently providing some advice to the target malaria team around preparation of an impact assessment in terms of reference. So that is my kind of main exposure to this area, and that's that thinking is what I'll be bringing to this conversation today. So I'm now going to move on to the slides, and the first one is a little video clip around what is an impact assessment. And so I will flick off the screen and go into YouTube, so that if you just pause and don't be alarmed when everything moves around a bit. Okay.
I'm very happy to have this conference. This is resilience and sustainability. This is a theme of this year. Because of this, we have to think more about impact assessment.
Environmental impact assessment is a systematic study of the unintended consequences of projects and of other human activities.
For example, if there's any development or any project, we need to understand how that particular project is going to have an impact on environment. And by environment, we mean basically everything. People, we mean the social aspect of environment, the economic aspect of environment, and the physical aspect of environment. So we need to understand how the particular project or development is going to have an impact on that. And that's what impact assessment is about before that project can actually go ahead, so that we understand its implications for the future.
Impact assessment is an important instrument to ensure both environmental and social fairness. At the same time that it will improve the quality of projects, so that it will make better projects that will enable us a more sustainable development.
Sustainable development is the hot topic these days. Impact assessment is the instrument to assess policies, development programs to ensure that they are sustainable, they're good for the society. So that is a tool used for policy making as well as infrastructure building.
Impact assessment is the process by which we understand and evaluate the positive and negative effects of a project from the beginning to the end of construction and all the way afterwards. It allows us to better understand what the effects of those projects are in order to make better decisions for the good of everybody.
Well, for me, impact assessment is an important field because it sets the framework for applying the mitigation hierarchy. So that entails trying to avoid, minimize, restore, and then where needed, offset impacts on biodiversity. Coming from an organization that's concerned with the conservation of natural resources, minimizing our impacts on biodiversity is critically important.
It's important because it's cheaper, easier, and more effective to understand the potential impacts of projects and avoid them than it is to try to react to them after they happen.
Impact assessment is an important field to me, especially because it makes it possible that every decision that's taken care of is made with good consciousness of environmental issues. And that's one of the most important things that we can do, that we take care of the environment, take care of the people that live in that environment, and that we make sure that that will lead to a good decision in the end.
Okay, I'm just going to move on now. Hopefully you found that as a helpful introduction to what is an impact assessment. I now wanted to just talk through a little bit about the general objectives of an ESHA. So an ESHA is an environmental, socio-economic, health impact assessment, and I'll be using that terminology a bit, so I thought I'd better explain it. So these are generic objectives. Every impact assessment may nuance this or order things differently, but in general terms, it really is a decision-making tool. So it's about integrating impacts and understanding of impacts and stakeholder feedback into the decision-making process and the design process of a project, an initiative, a policy, whatever it is that this impact assessment is focused on. It is to look and fully consider, identify and consider those project or initiative related impacts, whether they are positive and negative. Historically, we've very much focused on negative impacts, but in sort of modern day terms, we want to think about those positive and negative impacts and formally run them through a credible and a transparent process. We want to ensure that all project impacts on directly affected communities, individuals, biodiversity, environment, do not leave the environment or people worse off. So it's about the do no harm as a minimum. To also create that enabling environment to optimize those positive impacts is very important. The systematic assessment of each impact is part of this credible and transparent process, and it helps at the same time to inform the development of management measures, which, depending on their extent, their nature, will address those impacts to either avoid or minimize those negative impacts or enhance those positive. As well as being a process to gather stakeholder feedback and integrate it sort of iteratively into the evaluation of impact, development and management measures, this process is also a formal way to report back to stakeholders on what has been found, how their comments are being considered, and the management measures that have been put together. And then finally, but sometimes definitely not least, it is give to the government or other organizations an actual formal document so that they can pass the project through a regulatory process. So that, in essence, are the sort of central objectives of the process. This is a very schematic of the steps within the process. And as I said, Willy is going to cover this in more detail, but just to introduce to you to each phase. Scoping is at the start. You sometimes will have a screening phase before, which is really to understand what depth of impact assessment, what kind. So for example, in some countries, they may, if it's a regulatory framework you're looking at, they may just require an environmental impact statement, whereas in another country, it may be a full impact assessment. And that sort of screening will help you understand what scale of study. The scoping is the first step, and that's really looking at everything that exists, all the secondary data you can get your hands off, often a sort of preliminary visit to the area that's going to be affected by this intervention or project. And it's really, think about it like the sort of out the top edge of a cone. What you're trying to do is look at things broadly, but not in much depth. And that will enable you to sort of hone down to exactly what you need to focus on when you get into depth, which is around the baseline studies. So in those, you then gather a lot more primary data to inform your understanding of the context, potential impacts. And then you use that information alongside other information, including stakeholder engagement feedback, your project description, to identify potential impacts, describe those impacts, and then move on to evaluate those impacts. And that evaluation is done through a predefined process, criteria used, which are sort of set up depending on the nature of what you're evaluating. And then management measures and monitoring measures are devised to minimize or avoid negative impacts and enhance positive impacts. Stakeholder engagement runs throughout all of this, and it's sort of iterative, the way that you're feeding this information in. But the process ends with the production of, firstly, a draft report, a sort of final draft report, which is then again disclosed to stakeholders and to the government, often submitted to the government. At that point, there is some formal consultation period, and then the report is finalized. And so that, in essence, is this ESHA process. And it's the same process whether you run it just environment or just social or just health or integrated. I wanted just to introduce it so then you can put into context some of the additional things I talk through in a minute. So next, I wanted to flag some of the benefits of a quality impact assessment process. So firstly, from the project or research or interventions perspective, you very much hope that this gives you the opportunity to identify red flag issues, really understand what you're dealing with quite early on in that design process and development process, so that therefore you can hopefully avoid some of these issues in the outset. It gives, through the process, you hopefully will set out things that could avoid or reduce those negatives as much as optimize benefits. It increases understanding both internally but also externally of the change this intervention will bring, and builds capacity and understanding to respond effectively to that. It can give you, as mentioned on the video, it can give you that opportunity to identify the cost-effective solutions, cost savings that could be design, that design features could save money by doing it now rather than retrofitting later. It gives a foundation, a sort of a way of thinking about managing issues and building and managing relationships that could last the lifetime of the intervention. And then increases the understanding and acceptance of the project and the research within the team, but most importantly, among some of those affected and interested stakeholders. It does improve a project's success, especially if you use this process as a way to engage some of the regulatory authorities, those key stakeholders early. It very much becomes a bit of a partnership approach, a very informed, collaborative approach to develop and deliver the impact assessment, which can mean that when the final document arrives with the authorities, they're already really familiar, they're very aware, and it will pass through their hurdles more quickly. Next, it can, and I'm not sure how much this is relevant to your arena, but within sort of major infrastructure, oil and gas mining projects, if there are funding institutions, they will often expect an impact assessment to be done, and then use the information that emerges from this to make sound decisions about whether, understand what the risks are and the opportunities, but also see whether they should be putting funding into the project and the venture. So flip over to the other side and think about your stakeholders, and many of these items are exactly the same, that you're seeing the avoids negative impacts upon them, optimizes positive impacts to them, and gives them opportunities to grab those opportunities. And then it can be a really important first step to facilitating participation and building relationships, and could be ownership if this is something that you are looking to seek with your stakeholders. As we've talked about, the regulatory authorities, if they're closely involved, it can help them make informed decisions, hopefully in a timely way. It brings these stakeholder concerns really forefront into your process so that you can actually consider it and hopefully make better decisions on the basis of that. Ultimately, from a point of a stakeholder effect, especially those who are affected by your initiative, it has the ability to not see the community just as a single community, but actually to look at particular constituents within those affected stakeholders to see who are more vulnerable, who are more disadvantaged, how can we ensure that they aren't given greater negative impacts than some other stakeholders within those communities. So it really can be an opportunity to enhance the lives and the visibility of certain people. So in terms of ESHA processes and genetically modified organisms, or gene drive, to date, from what we can see, there's generally been a risk-focused look at assessment, and especially related to environmental considerations. So an environmental risk assessment kind of focusing around the biosafety aspects is I assume is very normal. When it comes to impact assessments, there are talk now within certain guidance, and on my next slide I'll cover some of those, where they note that there is the need for socio-economic and health impact assessments, but there is very little detail to that. It's just saying it would be good to do this, and we would expect this, but it doesn't tell you the how or the depth of the extent of what that means. At a national level, much like the first point, much more legislation so far about risk assessments, but increasingly countries are adopting and expecting impact assessments around GMOs. And Willy's going to talk about the national perspective a little more than I am here. In terms of an integrated impact assessment, legislation in countries may still be predominantly environmental impact assessment, but increasingly that socio-economic and public health expectations must become integrated and are part of this. So this is coming. It's just in each country there will be nuance about exactly what that looks like or what they expect. For that reason, we are kind of looking at international standards to see where are those, how can we apply those to GMOs. So firstly, just to say that the Cartagena protocol, WHO guidance, NASEM, ABNE, etc., have mentions of the need for environmental, socioeconomic and health impact assessment. But again, as I said before, it lacks detail. So in the absence of that detail, what we are finding is that we look to good international practice standards and guidance, those that are very commonly used across multiple sectors. And this list here are the most commonly referred to. So you have the World Bank Group, which is very much focused on public sector government work, which has its own set of environmental health and safety guidance. The International Finance Corporation, which is the commercial arm of the World Bank, they have a very clearly set out set of environmental and social performance standards. And each one, as you can see here, each one focuses on certain different ones, but the first standard, performance standard number 1, sets out the requirements around assessment, management of environmental, social risk and impacts, and also has engagement very firmly wedded in there. And then each of the other ones have a very particular nuance, whether it be labor and working conditions, biodiversity conservation, cultural heritage, etc. And so those provide quite a clear standard to that I often use in international impact assessments. They then have further guidance, and one particular I'll flag here is the IFC Stakeholder Engagement Handbook. So this one is a much more detailed set of guidance to help you think about how do you run an impact assessment process or other engagement activities linked to the project. What should that look like? You know, it'll cover things like grievance mechanisms and give you that detail that the standards don't have. The International Association of Impact Assessment, which was the group, it's a membership or global membership organization. It did that video that we saw at the start of this call. And they have an awful lot of guidance, best practice reference that you can use. The WHO Gothenburg consensus paper on health impact assessment has an added main concepts and approach, which is great. IAIA has more on health as well. They have special groups for different themes. So there's environmental impact assessment, social impact assessment, health impact assessment. And then the final one I want to mention are the guiding principles on business and human rights. And the reason this comes into this is the way that the UN looks to implement their protect, respect and remedy framework. And the value that this brings to the impact assessment process, it gives you another lens to sort of apply within the environmental, social and Health impact assessment, which can help you dig a little more deeply and see a wider frame of potential impacts as much as those individuals or rights holders that may be affected. So this is a kind of a commonly used cluster of standards that I think are useful to think about when it comes to impact assessment. So I'm now going to move on and just talk a little bit to the stakeholder engagement process, because it is very important and it runs throughout the ESHA process, as I noted before. The purpose of stakeholder engagement in the ESHA process is to help bring input from those affected stakeholders and others to that decision-making process. So really helping to verify, validate your understanding of those impacts. It brings those issues of concern as much as opportunities into your discussion. It helps you to understand and rank those impacts, because people will be calibrating and explaining about those impacts that will help you to apply your ranking criteria. And it helps you to come up with management measures which are relevant in that context, because you can probably come up with generic measures quite easily, but you need to nuance it for that local perspective. It is also a really great way to manage expectations, concerns that stakeholders have, because you have a dialogue, you have a mechanism by which to explain about your projects and a mechanism by which you can hear what they're hearing and then change what you're talking about to make sure that they really do understand the basis of your intervention, your research, whatever it is. And this is setting a precedent for ongoing engagement or reinforcing existing engagement that you already have. This is a way to sort of stay true, to build trust, as long as you are shown and you follow through on any promises to listen, to integrate, to consider their feedback. I wanted just to show you this spectrum, because engagement in itself can come in multiple forms. Everything from the most basic inform, when you as a project are just sending information out. You're telling them about your project. It's a very one-way street. Through the impact assessment, you can move into the consultation phase when they feed back and you hear, but also you might look to collaborate. For example, if you're working on your impact assessment with other parties, or you want to draw in your regulators, through to empower. And empower, most obviously, will be the final decision makers, which may be, in one case, the regulators. But if you are looking, for example, for community acceptance of your GMO research before you go and do your field trials, for example, actually you're placing some of your stakeholders in the empower space, where if they turn around and said, we just don't understand this, we don't like this, we don't want you to be here, potentially you may step away. So that could be, there is a whole spectrum, and I think understanding that is important to how you think about stakeholder engagement and how you want to involve people and their feedback in your process. The reason that I think it's particularly relevant for GMOs is obviously, you have some quite strong anti-GMO sectors and groups which are out there, especially at the international level, really lobbying. And I think, therefore, it makes the opportunity to engage through the ESHA really important. As I've mentioned, you may need community acceptance before a field trial can take place. And the ESHA could give a great opportunity to help start build that or reinforce what you've already built. And it's vital to also say that you can't go in on an ESHA on any project, but I think GMO even more, without preambling, so that when the impact assessment team arrive, the community already know that they're coming. They're already aware of the studies and the research that's going to take place, so that it doesn't surprise them, frighten them, or cause conflict. So, and what we've seen time and again with impact assessments around the world is that the more stakeholders understand the project, especially those who are effective, they understand certain impacts and the impacts of that project. If that means it's going to go much more smoothly. If, however, they don't understand the project and they become fearful, for example, working in Uganda, and there's an oil facility that's proposed. They've never seen an oil facility in their lives before. And then this idea of this thing arriving can create a lot of perceptions and concerns that may not be, if you did the whole study, may not be real, but for them it feels very real because they don't understand or haven't had the opportunity to understand what this project is about. And that can then trigger anxiety, worry, psychosomatic types of impacts. So I'm just going to move on to, I'm running out of time, so I'm just want to push on. But one of the other stages I want to focus on was the impacts themselves. Just to kind of introduce you to the basic concept, when we identify and rank impacts, what we do is we use 4 sets of data, in effect. The information about the project, what's happening, when, where, what resources, what components, the phasing of a project, all the data that we've gathered on the environmental, socio-economic, health context, the feedback we receive from our stakeholders, and then the reference standards. We bring this all together to come up with a definition of those impacts that we then pass through a set of evaluation. In this next slide, I'm going to give you an absolute cluster of impacts, and these are all socio-economic and health in nature. These are for large-scale projects, but actually you may well find that many of these are also in common with GMO-related studies. So bribery and corruption, ensuring that the processes you do, that people, that bribery and corruption isn't facilitated through this project, increased vulnerability of disadvantaged groups. You know, all of these things are very likely to come up on GMO or gene drive related projects as much as larger infrastructure. So I'm just going to keep giving you the splatter of all these different impacts because there's a lot of them. And then I'm going to focus on the next slide on just a small selection that may well be more relevant to gene drive or GMO field studies. So as you can see here, there are quite a few, everything from conflict, increased conflict, security and human rights, especially if that one could materialize, for example, if there becomes conflict in the area or GMO protesters go to an area that then the government may bring in security forces, which may cause human rights infringements. So these sort of things, there's a whole spectrum here. But I think this is worthwhile considering in the context of some of these projects as well. But every project will be case by case. This slide just captures some potential impacts that may feel slightly more tangible to our sphere here. So economic positive opportunities around employment, procurement, working with local people, employing local people, having groups buying food, so that's procurement. Strengthening social cohesion, because the fact that you are bringing impact assessment and having a lot of conversations around things may actually allow a more disparate community to focus and come together more than they have before. In the case of some of our work, the fact that you're talking a lot about, let's say, mosquito intervention, it may, just by talking about better ways to manage the disease, may increase disease avoidance, but nothing to do with the technology we're using. And then engagement, if you do this well, it can strengthen the inclusivity of community stakeholders in the consultation and the community decision-making process. I'm sure we've seen in some parts of society, all around the world, elements, people, groups often have a smaller voice than other groups and more dominant voices. And so that you can actually help by considering these different stakeholders to bring these voices in line a little bit and hear all of them. On the negative side, you might be disrupting certain livelihoods by the fact that you're there. Labor conditions, it may be that haven't considered about how much to pay people, and so maybe those need to be thought about. It could also be that certain people in society are getting the jobs, but others aren't. And so there's an inequality there that you need to be mindful of. Flipping the cohesion thing around, if you get a whole lot of conflict, concern, tensions arising in communities around the studies, you may then find that your social cohesion disappears and you get an awful lot more conflict that you're going to have to deal with or think about. Could be impacts on cultural heritage, whether it's tangible, as in a cultural heritage site, or intangible in terms of practices that people are doing. I think the health is a really important one to think about. I've mentioned already that psychosocial issues, mental health, stress, especially when people don't understand the consequences of this technology, it creates fear, it creates uncertainty and concerns in a multiple spectrum of areas. So I think it's really important to think about that. Finally, engagement. You could also find, if you don't do this well, that you just get a few very loud voices and that disenfranchises members of the community. And it means that sometimes that sort of sign off of community acceptance, or that a community is willing for you to proceed, actually isn't real. It's just a few individuals, and a lot of the others do not want this to happen or haven't even been asked if they want it to go ahead. So before I conclude, I wanted to flag up this really important point about issue versus impact. What you'll often find when you're hearing, I've heard it a lot on projects, people in a community, let's say I'm talking about somewhere in the Middle East, a community quite far away from a facility, oil and gas facility, and they're complaining about the oil facility creating dust, which is affecting their respiratory and giving them respiratory illnesses and affecting their health. On the face of it, you're thinking from science, okay, this is maybe a very dusty environment. Actually, this facility has minimal impact on the background dust. However, they are really concerned about this. So you must take their concern seriously. You cannot just say, it's not an issue. What you have to do is go through that process of understanding the impact, understanding their concerns, taking it seriously, and do the research or build to help them understand, to therefore reduce their levels of concern. So it is very, very important to remember that an issue and a concern is legitimate and it is considered a social impact, even if at the outset it is not supported by technical analysis. You can't just write it off. So to conclude, impact assessment with GMO, gene-drive technology is an emerging practice. There are few, if any, reference examples. And so this is an opportunity for us to kind of create precedent, really great quality practice, drawing on international, national best practice and standards, so that we actually set out a very good understanding of what is going on, share that data, inform decisions, whether they be for other projects or regulatory authorities or wider society. So there is a great opportunity here. A good quality impact assessment with stakeholder engagement is a unique opportunity to really robustly, transparently understand and manage those impacts. As ever, avoid and minimize negative, enhance positive. It can secure that regulatory clearance as much as build positive relations and understanding of what you're doing with the authorities, and then build and grow positive relations with the affected and interested communities. It is particularly important, I think, for GMO projects because of the, I think the scale of understanding that has to happen among affected and interested stakeholders. They really need to understand what this technology is to manage the concerns and to understand, and therefore to support a positive and effective impact assessment going ahead. And then finally, that last point about concerns and perceptions of affected stakeholders are legitimate impacts, even if they're not supported by technical analysis. So that is my feedback and my presentation. And I'd very much now like to, I'll stop sharing and I will hand back to Hector.
Thank you, Katherine. A very, very interesting talk. I'm sure that we'll have a lot to talk about during the question and answer period. But I'll, at this point, I'd like to turn it over now to Willy, who will go a little bit one further level down to look at the sort of the national implications and particularly a case study. So Willy, please go ahead and you can start your presentation.
Willy, you're unmuted.
You can hear me now?
Yes, I can.
Okay. Trying to turn on my video.
Yeah, you can just go ahead and share your screen.
Okay, sure.
There you go.
Okay, you can hear me now?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes. The title of my presentation is on environmental impact assessments on GMO projects and giving gene drive applications as a case study. In my talk, I'm going to talk about the oversight for impact assessments from the CBD and UNEP guidelines. And I'm going to talk about the stages of EIA and decision-making process, socio-economic impact assessments and environmental audits. This is basically what Katherine has talked about. I'm going to talk about the GMOs in general, and then introduce another aspect of environmental assessments known as strategic environmental assessments on biotechnology projects. And finally, I'll give suggestions on how to overcome some of the negative publicity on GMOs, including gene drives from my experience. The oversight for environmental issues generally internationally is from the Convention on Biological Diversity. And this is the most important by multilateral environmental agreement. And Article 14 of the CBD outlines the requirements on impact assessment and minimizing adverse effects. I want you also to understand that there is a supplementary protocol on CBD, that is on access and benefit sharing. And this is an international agreement which aims at sharing the benefits arising from utilization of genetic resources. This is very important because lately hot issues including DSI, that is digital sequencing information, are some of the major issues that are arising on issues of GMOs. Then we have the Cartagena Protocol and Nagoya-Kuala Supplementary Protocol on liability and redress. The oversight international protocol for biosafety is on Cartagena Protocol. And this aims to ensure safe handling, transport, and use of living modified organisms relating from modern biotechnology, and that they may have adverse effects on biological diversity, taking into account risk to human health. And then a supplementary protocol to Cartagena Protocol is the Nagoya-Kuala that is addressing issues of liability and redress on how to avoid damages, taking reasonable actions to restore biological diversity. I'll talk briefly about the Article 14 under the CBD. Under this article, parties are advised, as far as possible, to introduce appropriate measures requiring environmental impact assessments. And these proposed projects may likely have significant adverse effects on biological diversity, and a view to avoiding or minimizing such effects. And it emphasizes public participation in all the procedures that are undertaken under this Article 14. It also requires parties to introduce appropriate arrangements that ensures that environmental programs and policies are in place that governs the issues that are likely to have significant adverse impacts on biological diversity. And then the conference of parties shall examine on basis of studies to be carried out the issue of liability and redress that I've talked about in Nagoya-Kuala protocol, supplementary protocol for biosafety, including matters of compensation for damage, except where such liability is purely internal matter. Then there is a guideline already that is in place. During the Conference of Parties 8, Decision 8, number 28, there was an introduction of a voluntary guideline on biosafety inclusive impact assessment that was published by UNEP, United Nations Environmental Program. And during that decision, parties and other governments and other relevant organizations were urged to apply the voluntary guidelines, and also invited other multilateral environmental agreements to take note of and, if appropriate, apply the voluntary guidelines on biodiversity inclusive environmental impact assessments. These guidelines gave a definition of environmental impact assessments as a process of evaluating the likely environmental impacts of a proposed project or development. And this assessment process must take into account in the related socioeconomic, cultural, and human health aspect impacts. And these impacts should consider also whether they are beneficial or adverse. And it emphasizes the effective participation of relevant stakeholders, including indigenous and local communities, as a precondition for the successful environmental impact assessments. To those people who are familiar about the Cartagena Protocol, during the last COPMOP meeting, there was a major decision regarding the inclusion of indigenous and local communities as a precondition for approval of GMO or gene-drive studies. There are 5 main stages for doing an environmental impact assessments, and most countries have adopted the voluntary guidelines, and most countries already have these stages. Usually the stage 1 and 2, which is screening and scoping, are normally combined together. And then we have step 3, which is assessment and evaluation of impacts. Step 4, reporting. The 5, decision-making process. And then finally, monitoring, compliance, and enforcement, and environmental auditing. The first step is understanding whether EIA is required. And with the help of screening, you look at those factors to exclude those that are unlikely to have harmful environmental impacts. And this screening provides a trigger to start an EIA process. And the criteria should include biodiversity measures, or else there is a risk that proposals with potential human impacts on biodiversity will be screened out. And this process is normally end with the development of a screening decision. Step number 2 is scoping. It's normally used to define the focus of impact assessment study and to identify key issues which should be studied in detail. It is also used to derive terms of reference, for undertaking of an EIA study, and proposing the approach and also the methodology. And these terms of reference is normally guided by regulations in a country, and also guidelines that are issued by a regulator for environment. The scoping enables the competent authority or even professionals in countries in providing teams with issues or alternatives to be assessed, and now they can be examined, providing opportunities for stakeholders to have an interest, in EIA to provide an input, and to ensure that the environmental impact statement is useful to the decision-making process, as well as understandable to the public. And during the scoping phase, promising alternatives can be identified for in-depth considering the EIA study. Then step number 3 is assessment and evaluation of impacts and development of alternatives. These are linked to the public information and consultation and participation. And during the assessment, prediction and identification of likely environmental impacts of a proposed project or development, including detailed elaboration of alternatives, are considered. Step 4 is reporting, and this is normally done using an environmental impact statement or an EIA report, including an environmental management plan. Usually after doing EIA studies, the proponent has to develop an EIA report, which is referred to as a statement, and also an environmental management plan that is provided to the regulator. Decision-making process takes place throughout the EIA process in an incremental way. And at those stages, biodiversity issues should be taken into account. Normally, the final decision is usually a political choice. Usually whether the proposal is proceed and under what conditions. And these conditions are normally issued by the environmental regulator. And they may be rejected, and the project may be redesigned and resubmitted again. Normally, it's recommended that the proponent and the decision-making body should be two different entities. So basically, stakeholder and participation is a very important process throughout the decision-making process, as the impact assessment is about information, participation, and transparency decision-making. Public involvement is a prerequisite of the EIA, and it can take place at all levels. And as Katherine put it, there could be one-way flow of information, two-way flow of information, or real participation, during the EIA process through shared analysis and also participation in assessments. And the legal requirements for level of participation differs in different countries, but it's generally accepted that public consultation in the scoping and review stage are essential. Participation during the assessment study is generally acknowledged to enhance quality of the process. Stakeholders involved in impact assessment and also related studies. You have the proponent, who is the applicant, or a developer, in this case, developing a GMO or a gene drive product. Then we have the environmental assessment assessor, practitioner. In South Africa, people who are registered practitioners are known as environmental assessment practitioners. In Kenya, we are known as lead experts. And we have the competent authority that will decide whether to grant or refuse authorization, and then interested parties and affected parties. The general principle for approval of environmental projects is based on precautionary approach. And this applied in decision-making process. So when there is a risk of harm to biodiversity, high risk may mean that you require greater reliability and more information. And precautionary approach may not be pursued, in the case that there are minimal risks or a greater level of uncertainty can be accepted. So the decision should always seek a balance between conservation and sustainable use of economical viability and socially and ecologically sustainable solutions. So these are decisions that have to be weighed by the regulator. They have to strike a balance, between conserving and issues of sustainability and socio-economic viability of a project. Step 6 is the monitoring and compliance enforcement. Once you submit a report, activities that include monitoring, compliance, and enforcement, and environmental audit takes effect. And the guidelines in different countries do outline responsibilities. And the monitoring of the impacts is as proposed in the environmental management plan that the proponent has submitted. And this is to verify what is in the environmental management plan, ensuring that unpredicted impacts are identified or addressed in a timely fashion. So this is a cartoon of a summary of what really happens during the EIA process. We have the screening and scoping, which is an informal consultation between the proponent and the regulator. And once they submit the scoping report, it's subjected to regulatory review. And if regulatory approval is granted, a full study may take place by doing a baseline study, and drafting of the report that has a risk assessment, mitigation, and residual risk assessments. And this draft EIA is subjected to expert review and then stakeholder review also. And the final EIA with the environmental management plan is subject to regulatory review. And if you approve, monitoring and compliance will take place. I know Katherine talked about socio-economic impact assessments. And this was a result of a decision during the United Nations Conference on Environmental and Development, where that conference, they made it clear that it's evident that we can no longer think of the environment as well as economic and social development as separate fields. So the EIA cannot be divorced from matters of social impact, and both of them are very relevant during the EIA process. And the EIA shall address both positive and negative potential impacts related to the given project, social implication, as well as eventual transboundary effects. Normally, the socioeconomic aspects of a project are done by a competent authority, competent by a safety regulator, in collaboration with other agencies in a country. Social impact assessment, as Katherine has given, refers to a process to assess in advance the social consequences, whether intended or unintended, positive or negative, that are likely to follow from specific actions, projects, policies, and programs. In other words, the main goal is to bring sustainability and equitable social and economic environment, promoting community development and environment, capacity building, as well as developing social networks and trust. Our focus is mainly a proactive position to development and basing more on achieving more of positive impacts as opposed to negative consequences. It utilizes participation and building on communities' local knowledge. As you can see from this table here, the EIA cycle is normally more brief compared to SIA. In that, normally during the scoping, you can get an SIA implemented, and it means that you have to go through all these procedures, to achieve an social impact assessment study, and therefore, social impact assessment is more laborious in comparison to other aspects of the EIA project cycle. Then we also have environmental audits study. You need to know about this because this is a systematic evaluation of activities and processes of an ongoing project now. So if you have done a project, you have a building, or you are doing a GMO project, this is a study whereby you determine now how far these activities and programs conform to the management plan that had been approved by the regulator. So I'll narrow down now to environmental impact assessment on GMO projects in general. I know this has been a very controversial area in terms of GMOs. And the point of contention is that many of our scientists are not trained on social impacts, social effects. And therefore, it's normally very difficult for regulators, who are scientists or researchers, to fully understand the application of the EIA on biotechnology studies. And the Cartagena Protocol emphasizes the conduct of environmental risk assessments in compliance with the Cartagena Protocol, and these are examples of impact assessments of specific biotechnology projects. The EIA provides a check on realization of technology, which may or may be adopted depending on the environmental evidence of specific organisms or trade environmental combinations. And generally, EIAs for risk assessment for GM crops or other GM products, they are centered around 4 potential environmental hazards: integration, invasiveness, ecotoxicity, and unintended effects on other species. And these are normally outlined in the environmental risk assessment procedures in many countries. In many countries, the issue of GMOs requires that it has got to undergo an EIA before they are approved. For example, in Tanzania, you cannot, an application for field release or GMs cannot be permitted or licensed unless an environmental impact assessment has been carried out in accordance with the Environmental Act and regulations in Tanzania. In Kenya, major developments in biotechnology have been listed as a trigger, for doing EIA in Kenya. In South Africa, it's the same. If a minister has reason to believe that the release of genetically modified organisms into the environment may require or may pose a threat to the indigenous species of the environment, no permits may be issued unless an environmental assessment has been conducted. So you can see the importance of EIA in biotechnology projects, in that many countries in Africa, I've given a few examples, but many countries in Africa do have this clause in their environmental laws that requires an EIA before approval of biotechnology-related projects. So I'll talk briefly about the strategic environmental assessment. I know this is something that is new to many people, and this is about subjecting policy now, subjecting public policy programs and plans to test for compliance with sound environmental management. And typically the scope, for example, for biotechnology include environmental factors, potential gene flow, toxicity and invasiveness, poverty alleviation, gender issues, and governance and legal factors. This is very important to note, in that for gene drive, if you really have to succeed with gene drive, we need to understand the concepts behind the strategic environmental assessment. And there is a very strong rationale for doing this and understanding the strategic environmental audits for GMOs. And the reason is that the GMOs as currently approved are based on the principle of use case-by-case risk assessments. And usually the requirements develop comprehensive analysis for GMOs is normally done at the later stage during commercialization, and therefore there is need, to plan ahead, to do a comprehensive analysis of all the planning before you do a study, and this will reduce a lot of challenges with the public and also save on money regarding biotechnologies. So The strategic environmental approach to aim to promote rational and evidence-based decision making, and also has potential and practical challenges that must be considered. So there's a very strong rationale for people who are developing GMO products to fully understand strategic environmental audit. And a good environmental audit should inform decision-making process, stakeholders, and also providing sustainability of decisions that are made in a country. Lastly, I'm going to make suggestions towards overcoming negative publicity. I saw from Katherine's discussion that projects that have come up in some countries, have faced a lot of negative publicity. Gene Drive also has faced a lot of negative publicity and potential moratoria. And therefore, based on my own experience, I'm going to make a few suggestions, on how best we can reduce some of this publicity, and also ensure that the public is well informed about the technology that we are trying to develop. Generally, a developer or a researcher has to follow some key steps, during the conduct of their research. And it's very important that from the initial stages, a developer must appoint an environmental auditor. Somebody who is practicing in environmental audit at their own cost, and to help you manage the applications if you are sending for environmental release to a developing country in Africa. And guidelines that are available in countries, for implementation of environmental audits or impacts. And these are with the competent authority. They also have timelines on how they conduct their impact assessments. And therefore, as a scientist, you need, or a researcher or developer, you need to be conversant with the environmental laws in a country. Contact also the competent authorities for environments before you do your studies, as well as those who are doing biosafety approval. And an application for authorization usually has an application form. You must be conversant with the application forms for both for environment and also for environmental risk assessment for biosafety authorities. And in many countries, the competent authorities are the National Environment Management Authority. And in a country that doesn't have a standalone management authority, there could be some ministry departments that are in charge of environmental issues. So it's only the competent authorities in a country that approve projects, and this they do based on environmental regulations and other regulations that are applicable in a country. So I'm saying this so that developers and scientists should be very aware that at the onset of your research, you need to contact the appropriate environmental and biosafety authorities if you want your project to go smoothly. Some of the key steps for consideration. Though we have environmental impact assessment, I will really emphasize that we consider the environmental strategic environmental audits, as a primary source of our information to every developer before you do your research and studies. First of all, there should be the identification of objectives or impacts. Questions that involve proposed activity consistent with existing protocols, policies, and plans. So from the onset, a developer has to fully understand whether the activity is considered existing protocols. Is the country in compliance with certain protocols? Do they have policies and plans which are very relevant to what you're planning to do? Then we have step 2, identification of alternatives. So key questions here are, what are the reasonable alternatives that could meet the stated need for purposes and desired outcomes of the policy or planning process? Then step 3 is assessment of alternatives. What are some of the probable effects on biodiversity? Are there different alternatives? Then step 4 is consideration of practical uses. Can the plan be implemented? Can you implement your strategic environment audit plan? Can it be enforced? Are there some of the specific legal and institutional questions that are likely to affect success of your investment? In most organizations, we have the institutional biosafety committees. How do they operate? Do they have any contact with the environmental counterparts? And how do they make their own decisions? So the consequences of doing an environmental audit is very, very important. And I've given you a few examples here, but you can reach me out if you need more information on matters of strategic impact environmental audits. So some of the challenges that we have faced in many countries in Africa are the conflict to do with the environmental laws and the biosafety acts. In most countries that have biosafety acts, the trigger for EIA is the environmental law. For example, in Kenya, we have both the Biosafety Act and MCA. They both require the strategic impact, social impact assessment, as well as socio-economic considerations before release of GMOs. And in Kenya, we are fortunate that the National Biosafety Authority has guidelines for socio-economic consideration, but with a bias on economic impacts and less impacts, so emphasis on social impacts. On the other hand, the EIA requirement by the environmental regulator has more of the social impacts, emphasizing less on economic benefits. So we had to do a strategic environmental audit in Kenya to see whether we can match both. We can reduce conflict between the biosafety and the environmental laws. And one of the key output was that the current environmental release application format did not have specific clause requiring social impact assessment or environmental economic considerations. So to overcome this problem in Kenya, we had developed a supplementary form addressing the sections on socio-economic considerations, social impacts to be filled by a developer or an applicant. I know Professor Go is in the meeting in this webinar, and you can ask him also for more questions. And as a result of these efforts in Kenya, Kenya was recently able to use the environmental impact assessment to approve for PT maize and PT cotton that are currently undergoing performance trials. Another challenge is that there is a need to address negativity, through public participation and engagement. In many fora that I've seen, where we have people who are against the technology, their issues are normally centered around the strategic environmental audits. And for example, I've taken an example here which I saw recently, from a press statement from the Save Our Seeds. And when you look at their comments, they are very legitimate. And one of the aspects that they consulted here is about decision-making process of the technology, that it needs information more than risk assessment. So they propose that there is an urgent need for broader political debate and process for participatory, inclusive, democratic societal deliberation around desirability, costs, and benefits. Taking a neutral perspective on some of these comments from anti-groups, I think it's very important that we listen to them, become unbiased, listen to what are some of their areas. And normally the comments that we receive that we perceive to be negative are normally all environmental issues. And these environmental issues that are usually raised are normally in the environmental laws in a specific country. that many developers are not aware about. So it's important that we read our laws very well, understand the basis of negativity, and help to address them in our guidelines or in the laws of our country. Public participation is very important, as Katherine has given, as stated in our presentation. And we want to emphasize this. And the principle of openness and transparency requires documentation. And an important aspect of stakeholder and public participation in strategic impact assessment process is the communication of risks. So how are risks communicated? How the resource of the environmental impact considered? How do we have a risk communication strategy? So it's important that as we continue with gene drives, I want to emphasize that there should be a very important consideration for strategic and environmental audits. And it's important that developers and scientists who are involved in gene drive research should consider very strongly the use of strategic and environmental audit, in their own processes, doing research, and eventual decision-making process. Gene drive is a stepwise process. Development is a stepwise process. And the content use applications in many countries are very specific, and they give guidance on the requirements for social impact assessment or environmental impact assessments, and also how to do public participation. So it's important that as regulators also, they have to consider improving their content use guidelines, incorporating the principle of strategic environmental audit. So thank you very much, Hector. I stop for there for now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Willy. Thanks for both of the speakers for those very important and thought-provoking talks. We don't have a lot of time, so I'm going to do some triaging on the questions that have come in. I'd like to start with the first one by Delphine Thesi, because I think it'll give the opportunity for both you, Willy, and Katherine to respond. Delphine asks two questions, and I'd like us to address the first one. The difference between EIA and SIA in terms of steps that, Willy, you showed in your presentation is quite new to me. Is that specific to the Kenyan regulation? And could you clarify if the last slides on EIA for GMO are in fact related to ERA at times? The presentation seems to refer to both concepts interchangeably. And I'd like to, Willy, as you respond, I'd also like to broaden this question out, perhaps to also include Katherine on the response, and that is, there are different types of impact assessments that have been talked about here in both talks. And I'm just wondering if you can both try to help us understand the difference between the different types, and what, it seems like, for example, some seem to be more encompassing and others only a part of a small aspect of the impact assessment is being considered. So I was hoping that both of you could help to clarify some of the differences between the types of impact assessments. Willy, if you could please go ahead.
Okay, thank you so much, Delphine. Those are very pertinent questions. I've given my presentation based on the requirements of the CBD, the UNEP recommendations, and also going widely into the national laws and regulations in many African countries. And in my observation, the strategic environmental audits encompasses the EIA, in that it looks at a broad way of looking at the environmental requirements and procedures. And therefore, when you do a strategic impact environmental audit, you do an audit of the policies that you have in a country, and also what you will expect, to satisfy the environmental impact assessments in a country based on the guidelines that you have been provided. I know the issue of strategic environmental audit is a very new one, but it's a very good practice nowadays in that you encompass environmental impacts into the policies in a country. So this is very pertinent for gene drives in that it has transboundary movements. So you have to look at all those policy, international policy, national policy, as well as the local national environmental laws. I think that's what I can say for now.
Katherine, do you have anything to add to that, please?
Yeah. So I think what you will find at a legislative level within each nation, they will have some very clear environmental and sometimes environmental social impact assessment requirements. And they may specify separately a social impact assessment. Generally, what you need to sort of think about here in terms of difference is, what aspects are included. So if it was solely an environmental impact assessment, it may solely focus on the environment. If some nations talk about an environmental impact assessment, but actually what they define under the term environment is much wider, and it covers socio-economic and health potentially aspects under that banner of the environment. Certainly in Latin America, ambiente covers all of those things in legislation often. But for me at least, and when you think about an environmental impact assessment or a separate social impact assessment, the process for me are very similar. And there is an assumption of engagement and iterative design within both. But I do think you do need to look at the local legislation and then overlay the approach you want to take if you're looking at international standards as well, so that you come up with a version that can deliver on what the nation expects as much as what you would like if you're also committing to some international standards. I know it's not straightforward, but okay, just to go the game of terminology. EIA traditionally is environmental impact assessment, and that could be just a pure environment. SIA is traditionally just looking at socio-economic factors, not just the environment. Health impact assessment is just looking at health. So you can have any one of these individually if you wish. The ISHA that I've been talking about isn't integrated, so it's doing all of those things. And therefore the labeling on the tin says environmental, social, economic, and health impact assessment. So it's got it all and it's explicit. So these things can be done separately and done in an integrated way. Is that any help whatsoever?
Thank you. Oh, we'll leave it to the audience to respond.
Excellent.
And actually, Delphine, you had a follow-up question, which, if you don't mind, I'll leave to be responded to in writing, and so I can then have us address the question by Adam Cornish, which is to ask Willy to comment on the relevance of Article 19 of the Convention on Biological Diversity when considering an impact assessment related to gene drive organisms developed using biotechnology.
Yeah, thank you very much. Article 14 is very relevant to GMOs and specifically the gene drives.
It's talking about Article 19 of the CBD.
Article 19.
Yeah.
Oh, this one I have to consult on the Article 19. I'm not very relevant to. I'm not conversant on this one, right? I have to read it.
Okay. Well, then we'll leave that to be responded to in writing then.
Okay, sure.
Let me then. Actually, there's another question for you on the line. this is actually from Katherine. You talked about strategic environmental assessments and that is an important consideration now. Are there good examples, Willy, of a biotechnology SEA that you know about that's been conducted?
Yeah, I've seen some articles from the southern part of Africa, the South African region, where they have analyzed the various laws in the South African region and tried to interpret the relevance of SEA to their situations. I can look it up and share.
Great. Yeah, we'd be very happy to share that. And actually, that thought occurred to me also, Katherine, when we were talking, when you showed that slide of the different international documents that relate to environmental impact assessment. And I was hoping if you would be allowing us to share the links, and we can share that on the GeneConvene Virtual Institute site.
No, absolutely fine. If you look in the notes on that slide, all the links are there.
Perfect. We'll do that then. Thanks a lot. And actually, Willy, as kind of a follow-up, also, Camilla Beach asks, in addition to the SEA question that Katherine asked, are there GM crop EIAs in Kenya that are in the public domain?
I'm not sure that they're in public domain, but I'll humbly request, I'll have to contact the National Biosafety Authority to find out whether they are now publicly available. But I'm very sure that there was a document, an EIA report, and also a decision from NEMA to enable the onward trials, for PT maize and PT cotton. And trials are currently going on in the country.
Great, thank you. Unfortunately, our time is up, and so we'll have to leave the responses to the numerous questions that we still haven't addressed to be responded to in writing. And so, for those who've asked questions, please be looking for those answers that are posted when the recording of this particular webinar will be posted. So apologies that we didn't get to all of them, but we'll have the written answers to those posted as well. So with that, I'd like to then thank both Katherine and Willy for their participation today, and thank them for their very good talks. So this ends the regulatory and policy considerations series. So David Obrochta and I thank you for attending both the previous series on the status of the science of gene drives, and this one will be continuing in 2021 with more webinars that are centered on different themes, and we welcome suggestions for topics you'd like to see us explored. You noticed at the end of the last presentation, sorry, the last presentation, some of you received a questionnaire. It's a brief one that we're going to also be sending to you at the end of this one. And we'll also be sending within the next few days a questionnaire and about the entire series on regulatory and policy considerations. And we hope you'll help us in improving our webinars by responding to both those as the case may be. So with that, again, we thank you for attending these webinar series, and please watch this space. We'll be providing you with more of these types of webinars in 2021, and I'll see you then. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hector. Bye.
Thanks, Hector.
Bye.